Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third lecture of Origins, which is the part of the Dasara Lecture Series. I request our director, Dr. B.R. Guruprasad, to formally welcome you all and also introduce the speaker.
Respected Professor Vidyanand Nanjundiah, Professor Srinivasan, other professors and academicians, Dr. Shailaja, Dr. Sita, and Mr. Pramod, and my dear students. What a thrilling day today for me, really. There are so many people whom I know, they are here for this lecture. Today, I'm very happy to introduce Professor Vidyanand Nanjundiah. Till 3 days back, I was not knowing that he is the son-in-law of Professor M.A. Setu Rao, who had done so much for Kannada science communication, in fact. Science communication in general and science communication in Kannada in particular. He is one of my gurus who enabled me to, I'm using this very cautiously, enabled me to become a science communicator. Thanks to that, today I'm standing here to introduce Professor Vidyanand Nanjundiah. I express my pranam to Professor M.A. Setu Rao. His daughter is also here. And thank you. And Professor Srinivasan, a retired professor who has done a lot for our planetarium. Earlier has been here, and he has graced the occasion. Thanks to him, thanks to you, sir, and many other people. As I said, the earlier director, Dr. Shailaja, and Mr. Pramod Galgali is here. Dr. Sita is here from Raman Research Institute, and more than that, my earlier colleague in ISRO. So nice. So now I welcome all of them and you all to this third lecture in this year's Dasara Lecture Series. This is the third one, as you know very well. Very appropriately, when the theme Origins was selected, first, obviously it was, the first lecture in this series was Origin of the Universe, Origin and Evolution of the Universe by Professor G. Srinivasan. It was also a blissful experience to listen to him. Then came the Origin and Evolution of the Earth by Professor Ramanand Chakrabarti from the Indian Institute of Science. Yet another thing, and today I'm sure it will be equally thrilling. Origin of life, yes, that is one of the most thrilling subjects, I'm sure about it. And the next lecture tomorrow will be Origin of Material Properties by yet another professor. Okay, and now let me introduce Professor Vidyanand Nanjundiah. He is too modest. He has sent only a small paragraph of his CV. I don't know. Modesty at its best, I feel. Okay. He studied at St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, today's Mumbai, with he graduated in physics and mathematics, interestingly. And then at University of Chicago, he obtained his PhD in physics. His research thereafter has been in biology, almost all of it in the developmental and evolutionary biology. He has worked at the Indian Institute of Science, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and now he's working at, he's at Center for Human Genetics. So, today, as I told you, the subject is very, very interesting and thrilling, both exciting, definitely. And if you have seen the synopsis of this lecture, he has very clearly brought out how the matter is organized, how if it were to be organized in a particular way, okay, it probably can give rise to whatever we call as life, that kind of thing. So anyway, I don't want to give a lecture here, and once again, sir, on behalf of JNP, I welcome you and thank you very much for accepting our invitation to deliver the talk. Kindly, the stage is yours, sir. I'm sorry, I couldn't get the name immediately. Tomorrow it will be Professor Ramakrishnan, S. Ramakrishnan of Indian Institute of Science, who will be talking, the last lecture in this series, he will be talking about origin of material properties. Over to Professor Vidyanand Nanjundiah. Sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guru Prasad. It's an honor to be invited to speak here, especially in a forum such as this, the Dasara Lecture Series. I have prepared this talk for a lay audience. I was asked to do so, and I'm already frightened by the prospect of there being at least one expert in the audience. There may be others. If so, please excuse me, because this talk is going to be pitched at an extremely elementary level, really, not even that of, shall we say, college students. I'll begin by repeating what I heard Dr. Guru Prasad say 3 days ago at a different function where we met. And he started, I think, one part of his talk by saying, no one knows how to define life, but we can say things about it. I'm going to be doing the same here. I'm not going to try and pretend I know a crisp and succinct definition of life to tell you, but I'll talk about it. So a few preliminary issues before we get into what you might call the heart of the subject. Everyone thinks that the topic of life, and particularly the origin of life, is an important topic. There's something intrinsically fascinating about it. At the same time, very few people work on it, to my knowledge. There are people who work on it, by the way. There are people who are specialists in this area. I'm not one of them. But there are very, very few indeed. It doesn't engage the attention of, let's say, a great many physicists or chemists or biologists. There are many reasons for this. One of them is the seeming difficulty about coming to grips with the topic itself. Another is the feeling that what is more important is to understand the properties of living materials as they are now, viruses, bacteria, plants, animals, and so on, rather than go back into history. History in general isn't something that seems to excite a great many people. So there are different reasons why people stay away from it. As far as we are concerned, we begin with the assumption, which seems a pretty solid assumption, that the state of being alive is a property exhibited by matter, certain kinds of matter. And there are, I don't know how many, 50 or so examples around here in this room of living matter. That's what it is. And I'll take that for granted. There's really nothing else in terms of primary constituents which make up life. There's of course a great deal of talk about the implications of life, how it had to have a non-material origin, etc., etc. But as far as we are concerned, these are beliefs which may be comforting at the personal level, but have absolutely no basis in rational thinking and analysis, which is what we call science, of course. What is it that living matter displays which seems to make it stand out from non-living matter? A great many things, among which a metabolism, that is the ability to make use of energy sources in the environment to drive synthetic reactions, build things which would otherwise be difficult to do. Information transfer, which is a different way of using the word reproduction, because what happens in reproduction is not so much that parents have children or that a bacterium gives rise to other bacteria. It's not so much that as the fact that parents endow others with the capacity to become parents in turn. So it's that sense in which one uses the term information transfer. So a bacterium tells other bacteria how to make bacteria, that kind of thing. You can think of it as a cookbook recipe which is being transmitted down generations rather than the cooked dish itself. Then of course, living matter exhibits very intricate organization, and that's most obvious in the so-called higher organisms like ourselves. By the way, this Adjective higher is one which we have chosen for ourselves. It's not clear whether it's objectively meaningful, but nonetheless, we know that we are made up of sub-portions which are very intricately organized. There are some things which are common to all sorts of living matter. The molecular constitutions are the same. Many of you will have heard the terms DNA and RNA and proteins. We'll come across them presently. And interestingly, these molecular constituents, these molecular building blocks of living matter, play games amongst themselves in the same way. So the paths of production that they use, the paths of breakdown that they use, the paths of signaling that they use are pretty much the same with differences all the way from bacteria to us. So that's something common. Finally, living matter exhibits one unifying principle which is all important, which is that it has evolved, which means that its present state depends on a past state which depended in turn on a state before that, etc., etc., etc. So these are a few general background comments one can make. Okay? How does one go about trying to understand what there is about living matter that is worth knowing? So what is the explanatory framework that one uses for understanding living matter? Standard physics and chemistry. There is nothing else. I mean, that's the name of the game as far as all natural science goes. And unless and until someone comes up with new fundamental phenomena, it's standard physics and chemistry which will have to serve us. So in this respect, we are in a more fortunate position than, let us say, people who work in areas like astrophysics and cosmology. They speak about things like dark matter and dark energy, which still remain mysterious. You may have, those of you who attended Professor Srinivasan's lecture may have heard of these terms, may have come across these terms. Fortunately, we don't have to deal with them because we are here on earth and the matter that's around us is the matter that concerns us, and it's ordinary matter. Finally, of course, there is natural selection. So all of these ingredients have to be put together, and living matter has to be analyzed in terms of what it is made up of, in terms of the laws of physics and chemistry, what one calls natural laws, and of course any special conditions which may have applied at the time a particular form of living matter came into being, what we call initial conditions. Well, where and when did life originate is obviously the first question one would ask in this context. There's a long list of things here which I will not bother to read through, but basically we have a roughly satisfying picture of where the earth ended up as it is today, which is starting as a piece of molten rock 4.5 or so billion years ago, believed to have formed by the accretion of some kind of interstellar dust at roughly the same time as the sun. This earth cooled down gradually. In the course of cooling, many things crystallized out. At some stage, the earth was bombarded by icy comets, which gave the first input of what was to become water later. And eventually, with successive bouts of cooling, you had a layer of water, which you call the oceans around the earth. And once the temperatures had come down sufficiently well, the solid earth, the oceans, and whatever atmospheric gases there were, which of course were formed by outgassing from the rocks as they cooled, whatever they were, provided the raw material from which these entities of living matter arose. This is the best picture we have, and this is what we think happened. It's hard to give a precise date to when this began. We think it was perhaps about 4 billion years ago, 4,000 million years ago. One small but interesting point, this is a matter of some dispute among the specialists in the field. Many people believe that at the time life first arose, there was very little oxygen, maybe no oxygen in the atmosphere, so that it was largely what's called a reducing atmosphere. Whereas there are some people who seem to think that there was some oxygen in the atmosphere already then, wasn't an entirely reducing atmosphere. But we won't get into that. What we do know is that the oxygen that we have now is largely a product of living matter itself, largely a product of oxygen having been produced by what are called cyanobacteria, blue-green algae. So most of the atmospheric oxygen which makes life possible for us came from our ancestors. And very early on, it's fairly clear that this high level of oxygen could not be sustained simply because oxygen is so reactive. Basically, it would have burnt things up. Well, that's a cartoon picture of the Earth. The point of interest for us is that there's a crust which is a very tiny part of the Earth, the first 40 kilometers according to this slide, which also includes, as far as we are concerned, liquids, the ocean. This is where the entire story of interest to us plays out, but it's not uninfluenced by the interior of the Earth, because there are things happening in the interior which also affect the surface. But we will not be concerned with that. Our story simply has to do with the material on the top in this crust. And as I said, the first signs of life seem to have been about 4 billion years ago. Interestingly, we have fossils of a very unexpected kind which are present today, which testify to that. These are these so-called stromatolites, which look like rocks, but what they are layered structures, with each layer having been deposited by bacteria and successive layers being deposited by successive generations of bacteria. And we know, or we can infer pretty accurately, that this must have been made by bacteria, because they are doing that even now. So stromatolites are being formed even today, exactly like this. And geological dating permits us to date them this far back. Fossils of the kind which involve cells which are more advanced than bacteria, but are found, for example, in us, the technical name for them is eukaryotes, are about 1 billion, beg your pardon, are about 1.5 to 2 billion years old, and some of these are pictures showing such fossils. So please remember, these are actual evidences of fairly advanced life forms 1.5 to 2 billion years ago. The oldest fossils of this kind have been found in rock formations in the US, and they go back to well over 2 billion years ago. So by 2.5 billion years, life had not only appeared on Earth, but it had reached a stage which we can fairly call advanced, because very likely these creatures, they were still single-celled creatures, unicellular creatures, but as far as we can make out, these creatures had the same building blocks that make us up. So it's in that sense that, meaning the same cellular composition that we had. The old atmosphere, as I already told you, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, was largely made up of reducing gases, probably carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, something relatively neutral like nitrogen, possibly methane, all formed by outgassing from rocks. And as I already told you, very unlikely that there would have been oxygen, simply because it was highly reactive. And most of the oxygen, which I have told you already, came as a result of photosynthesis from these blue-green algae much later, after life had evolved. Now, let's take a look at the elemental composition of living matter, and I've chosen the human body as an example. One could just as well have taken bacterium, and of non-living matter which we think is the likeliest candidate from which living matter arose. If you look at these three tables, the first column tells you about the Earth's crust, the second the composition of the ocean, and the third the human body. So what you see in each column is a listing of the most significant elements in each of them, and the numbers next to them give you the proportions of those elements out of the total. So let's take a quick look. In the Earth's crust, you have 48% oxygen, 22% silicon, about 8% aluminium, 5% iron, and so on. So you're already at something like 72%, and with calcium and sodium you come close to 80%. In the ocean, much more oxygen, that's because of the water, of course, H2O, 86% roughly, 11% hydrogen, chlorine, sodium, magnesium, sulfur. This will add up to close to 99 if you perform the addition. In the human body, hydrogen is the most prominent, oxygen, both of these are fairly high in the ocean, you will notice, not so much in the crust. Then you have carbon, which is very, very rare, both in the ocean as well as in the Earth's crust. Nitrogen, to some extent, it's in the atmosphere, but again, not in the crust or the ocean. And then you have calcium and phosphorus. The point about these numbers is, if you look at them a bit carefully, you can see that again, I repeat, I'm not using the human body here for anything particular. It's simply because we are humans and we can relate to the human body. You could have used any typical animal body, or for that matter, a bacterium, as I said, to make my point. And the point I want to make is simply this. When you look at living matter, you have, of course, the same elements that you find in the oceans and in the Earth's crust, but in very, very different proportions. So statistically speaking, we are not what statisticians call a fair sample of what we see around here. So there's been some kind of choosing in the way the elements around were used to make living matter. Carbon, of course, being the most prominent exception, if you see in this list, which seems to have been really rather essential for living matter. Now, the reason that is important, of course, is that if you want to set up either theories or testable experiments for how inanimate matter could have given rise to living matter, these are some of the things you will look at. These are some of the elements you will look at. Something else which is interesting. The sketch there shows the familiar periodic table of Mendeleev, which I think most of us would have learnt in school. These are simply all the naturally occurring elements listed according to what's called atomic number, which is the charge in their nucleus. These elements have been marked out using these blue squares or red squares or dotted red circles to indicate two things. One, the elements which are marked out are the ones which have been used by either bacteria or plants or animals. Secondly, there is a kind of relative apportioning of those elements. So as the guide there says, the red circles, both the full circles as well as the dotted circles, indicate elements which seem to be more or less essential for all kinds of life. Some of them constitute the bulk of body weight, some of them very little. On the other hand, the ones marked out in these blue squares and the dotted green outline are elements which you also find in living matter, but very, very, very rarely. These are called trace elements because they are found in traces. However, in many cases, these trace elements are crucial for living creatures. And among those trace elements, as you look at the picture there, and I'm looking at the central block of red, central block of blue squares, you have vanadium, chromium, coming down molybdenum, tungsten, manganese, iron, cobalt, nickel, and so on. So these are elements which at some stage seem to have been picked up by living matter during that period of choice to carry out essential functions, and they also give you a clue, a much better clue in some sense than the commonly occurring elements, because they of course are there whether you like them or not, but the trace elements offer an important clue, because now you can start building theories with your knowledge of the chemistry of those elements, saying what kinds of things could those elements have taken part in building, what kinds of reactions could those elements have facilitated. So this again is a clue as to how things might have started. Okay. First question, could life have originated in the form that we know it spontaneously? There is this famous experiment of Louis Pasteur's, again comes from our school record, which said it cannot, and the experiment is straightforward. Pasteur took a flask in which he had put meat broth, liquid, nutrient rich liquid, heated it up so as to kill any organisms which were living there, let it cool down, and then asked, would things grow there spontaneously? The answer, it turned out, depended on the shape which the neck of the flask took. This is why this is known in textbooks as the swan's neck flask experiment. And the way he did it was very simple. If the flask neck was so shaped, and you can see that in the top row, if it was so shaped that after cooling, water condensed where the flask neck comes down, and because of that water condensation no air could come inside, nothing could grow. On the other hand, if he broke the neck, or if he didn't allow water to condense, basically if he allowed air to come from outside into this sterile broth mixture, things could grow. So Pasteur said, look, nothing can grow by itself spontaneously, but it has to come by seeding from outside. Now, this experiment can be looked at in two ways. One is to say, yes, nothing can grow, nothing alive can come about spontaneously. And from there, of course, came this famous dictum of Pasteur's that life can only come from life. But the second way to look at it is that Pasteur's experiment only pointed to the kinds of life forms that he could recognize, not to the kinds of life forms which might have arisen very, very long ago. Therefore, the experiment has to be treated with caution. It only tells you that you cannot get something like a fungus or a bacterium or even a worm which can arise in rotten food coming up in this sort of experiment. But that isn't to say that you couldn't get any kind of primitive life arising which you could not presumably recognize. And there's a big quote from Darwin there which I will let you read for yourself, which is interesting because Darwin on the one hand agreed entirely with Pasteur. He said there can't be anything like spontaneous generation. On the other hand, he said, look, that is only in terms of the forms of life that we know now. On the other hand, if there are more primitive kinds of life which we don't know, which might have been around at the time that life originated, then perhaps we have to wait, not say that Pasteur's experiment has finally shown that kind of thing to be impossible. Today, all the living forms that we know satisfy two requirements. We've listed them at the beginning. Two of them are central. One is called reproduction and the other is called metabolism, and I've defined both of them roughly in terms of what we understand today. To a good approximation, reproduction depends on the property of a molecule called DNA to be copied. So it's a little bit like a Xerox copy. During this copying process, DNA needs a lot of help from other molecules. One of those is a molecule called RNA, and the third is a molecule of a general category called proteins. So DNA can make copies of itself, and in order to do so, it has to take the aid of RNA and protein. So for the moment, we'll simply think of these as names without going into what the letters, what D, N and A mean, and so on and so forth. So this is the essence of reproduction as we understand it in most cases. There are minor exceptions. There are some cases in which you don't have DNA, you have only RNA and proteins and so on. But by and large, this turns out to be true. Metabolism, again, we've learned this in school, involves transactions generally between small molecules, not always small molecules, generally between small molecules, but these are transactions, meaning transformations of one molecule to another, which are catalyzed by enzymes, and these enzymes are precisely the proteins that we saw a moment ago. So, DNA is at the center of reproduction, proteins are at the center of metabolism. You need both DNA and proteins for something to qualify as being alive, for you to say that this kind of a thing is alive. These metabolic reactions that proteins catalyze are the reactions of ordinary chemistry, but they are speeded up enormously by the presence of these proteins. One presumes that the reactions would still take place even without these proteins, but they would take times of, the duration they would take would be so long that it loses all meaning. Proteins enable these reactions to be carried out within lifetimes. So you have DNA today, you have proteins today. Have they been there all along? So could the origin of life really have been some kind of coming together of DNA and proteins? Unfortunately not, almost certainly not. And the reason for that is both DNA and protein are sufficiently complicated in themselves to make it clear that they couldn't have come from, inanimate matter directly. There is no doubt of that at all, and therefore that's a possibility that no one takes seriously. Too complex to have arisen from scratch. The second question which comes up in this regard is, which came first, reproduction or metabolism? Or to put it in different words, which came first, DNA or proteins? This question too is not easy to answer, simply because of the fact, and I have shown that in the slides which preceded this one, DNA, in order to copy itself, needs proteins. Proteins, in order to be made, need DNA. So each of these two so-called essential elements of life, each of these essential elements needs the other. So the question of which came first is like this so-called chicken and egg question of whether the chicken came first or the egg came first. It's not a meaningful question. So clearly the proper question to ask is something else. But the background to this question, which is something being required for something else, and that something else being required for the first thing, that background turns out to be very fruitful in thinking of how life originated. This kind of a process, which we have just illustrated, so DNA is used to make protein, and then protein is used to make DNA, so that when you go around the circle, you have some DNA used to make more DNA. This kind of thing is called an autocatalytic process. So it's like a catalytic process, but where something seems to be catalyzing its own formation. That, the notion of autocatalysis, and we'll see a bit of this in what follows, that notion turns out to be very important in stimulating people to think of how life originated. But it's clear that DNA in the form we know of it and proteins in the form that we know of it could not have been there at the origin of life. So what people do is to try and say, okay, DNA and proteins in the form that we know them couldn't have been there at the origin of life, but is there any way of inferring what there might have been? And this is where people make use of the principle of evolution, which in simple language is also referred to as modification with descent. In other words, as living creatures have given rise to more living creatures, their children so to speak, their progeny, over the course of time, these progeny, these descendants have become modified. We won't go into the reasons why they become modified. That's an interesting subject in itself. That's the topic of evolutionary biology. But we are very confident that they have been modified. Therefore, we are confident looking backwards that all of us here in this room today, plus everyone and everything alive, including the plants in this room, everything alive on earth, had ancestors, who had ancestors, who had ancestors, and so on and so forth. And if there is any way in which we can go backwards to follow this lineage of ancestors in reverse, maybe we can hit upon something that was there at the beginning. So it's a little bit like trying to stand at a river delta and then by working backwards try and figure out where all these individual branches came from, where they originated from. And this kind of working backwards gives rise to what's called an evolutionary tree. This is a cartoon of such an evolutionary tree, And the cartoon is meant to represent plants and animals and microbes that are alive today. You should keep that in mind, because the only things we can see, we can work with, are what there is now. We can't work with creatures of the past. So the tips of the branches of this tree represent the plants and animals and microbes and anything alive today. And the tree represents the notion that as you go backwards in time, closer and closer to the root, more and more of the creatures that are alive today had common ancestors. So wherever two branches meet at a point, that point is the common ancestor of these two creatures that are at the tips of those two branches. So if you look at the right at the top of this tree, this is a cartoon, of course, doesn't represent anything like an accurate picture. You see something like a dog, which is supposed to stand for all, I suppose, mammals in this cartoon. And then you have something, primitive creature with a backbone. If you go backwards, you reach, you come down the tree, you see primitive creatures which are similar to the insects of today, and so on and so on and so on. Two important points which one must point out. This has nothing to do with my talk, but this is a misconception in many, many people's minds. Okay. One point. This tree does not mean that that dog or mammals, if you wish, are right at the top and in some sense are evolutionary superior to things at the bottom. That dog is at the top and there are some bacteria and algae and so on at the bottom of this tree, only because to show everyone at the same height would clutter up the tree. So it's purely artistic demands that have made some branches stop midway and some branches go all the way to the top. In fact, the kinds of trees that evolutionists themselves work with are like that. All the tips are at the top. So keep that in mind. There's nothing intrinsically superior or inferior or advanced or less advanced about this thing. Nothing objectively so. Right? Point one. The second point here is, there seems to be an increase in simplicity, or if you wish, a decrease in complexity as you go down the tree, which is as you go more and more in the past. So it's a good bet that in trees of this kind, to the extent that you can successively trace them backwards, to that extent you should be able to infer something, if you can, you should be able to infer something about last common ancestors. The hope is, by doing this, you can go back to the one, that's the hope, common ancestor of everyone, which is the last universal common ancestor. Same evolutionary tree as you saw before, except that this is less of a cartoon than the previous one. It's still cartoonish in the sense that it's representative and doesn't pretend to be accurate. What it does is to show you that when geneticists and biologists build such trees, and in order to build such trees, I didn't tell you this because that would take us into other details, they make use of these DNA molecules, which are also known as genes, by the way. I didn't use the word so far. They make use of these DNA molecules and see what the sequences of DNA molecules are in different living organisms today, and use very clever inference, mathematical analysis, computer simulations, all sorts of things to try and infer what their common ancestors were. Please keep in mind the ancestors are no longer around. By the way, it's interesting that this form of tree building is formally very similar to what linguists do when they try to infer the forms of languages that existed in the past, which have given rise to the languages that we speak today. So linguistic tree building is very similar to genetic or evolutionary tree building. So this is a more realistic tree and shows two things. One is, even this tree seems to indicate that there was a common root below, which is that straight line which goes all the way down. The second interesting thing about this tree is that it indicates three branches. They have been given technical names there. For our purposes, the branch called eukaryote, which is on the right, eukaryota, is the branch which comprises us and the so-called complex organisms and plants. The two other branches, one of which is called bacteria here and the other of which is called archaea here, are both creatures which are bacteria-like. In fact, until very recently, until the early 1970s, both of them were clubbed under bacteria. So the surprising thing about this tree, this aspect of this tree, is that we ourselves seem to be more closely related to some bacteria. As you can see here, the eukaryotes are more closely related to archaea than either of us is to some other kinds of bacteria. So there are pairs of bacteria which are more distantly related than we are to some bacteria, which again gives you an interesting sidelight on notions like what is advanced and what is elementary. Nonetheless, the tree conforms to our conventional belief that as you keep moving downwards, you get more and more convergence, and ultimately you converge to a single root. Unfortunately, that picture doesn't hold up entirely, because when you start doing this even more carefully, you discover that there are side branches. Now that obviously makes the search for a single root meaningless, because things mix up with each other. And if you saw that river delta picture carefully, you would have noticed that as you go further and further backwards, you also get side branches in rivers, so you never have a uniform pattern of convergence. What does this mean? This means that possibly there was no single universal common ancestor. Possibly the search for a single unique origin of life is misplaced, and what you had is a bunch of candidates from which came the forms of life that we know now. So the search for one kind of primitive, self-reproducing, metabolic system, which ultimately gave rise to everything that we see today, probably is a misplaced search, worth keeping in mind. The reason for that is these side branches that you see here. But the technical term for that is horizontal gene transfer. It's fairly common among bacteria, very rare among us, but still exists. By us, I mean here the eukaryotes, not human beings. I'll come back to this later. There are interesting reasons for thinking, and I mentioned this briefly, I think, before. There are interesting reasons for thinking that the present living world, which has DNA, RNA, and proteins, DNA being required for making RNA, and DNA and RNA both being required for making proteins. There are interesting reasons for thinking that this world came from an earlier world in which there was no DNA but only RNA and proteins. It's referred to as the RNA world, but we'll come to that later. Okay. Now, having set up the stage in this way, I will very rapidly take you through some theories and models that people have made in trying to actually come to grips with how inanimate matter could begin to display characteristics that you associate with life. One particular theory which we should get out of the way, not because it is uninteresting, but because it doesn't help us, is called panspermia. There are many well-known names associated with this theory. Basically, this theory says that life did not originate on Earth, that it came thanks to seeding of some form from outer space. Now, what was the form of this seed? Obviously not the kinds of seed that you associate with plants today, but perhaps complex molecules, perhaps amino acids, perhaps elementary building blocks of the same kind that are used in DNA, other organic compounds. And the reason people think of this at all is because such complex compounds, or at least some of such complex compounds, are found in meteorites. So meteorites that hit the Earth have been picked up and studied for their composition, and sometimes they do indeed turn out to contain organic molecules of the kind that would be interesting from an origin of life perspective. So that's a reason for people to think of it at all. But we will not pursue it further simply because even if that's true, it only pushes the problem back further. It doesn't help us in saying how they originated, which is what we are trying to look at. Two big names which are associated with any theory of origin of life are those of a Russian called Alexander Oparin and an Englishman who became an Indian later called J.B.S. Haldane. I will not go into these theories here, but I'll just mention Oparin had an idea that life could have originated in a primitive reducing atmosphere, which is what we've looked at, with a source of energy which was probably, thermal energy, heat, by the spontaneous formation of what he called coacervates, which are essentially aggregates of organic molecules. He basically said you could get these aggregations formed, and these aggregations could show some kind of primitive metabolism in the sense that they could assimilate other compounds, maybe they could act as somewhat catalytic in nature by breaking down other compounds and so forth. So that was the essence of Oparin's idea. Haldane's idea was that again a primitive reducing atmosphere, but here the oceans, the water played a major role. And what Haldane thought that here the energy would be provided from the sun primarily through its ultraviolet radiation, and this radiation in this reducing atmosphere would be able to build up compounds in the oceans until their density achieved high enough for them to do the kinds of things that Oparin had postulated. Haldane did this independently of Oparin. And Haldane used a phrase to describe the nature of this primitive ocean from which life forms eventually arose, so some kind of self-reproducing entity arose. He called it a hot dilute soup. Now, Haldane was very good at coining phrases, and this phrase caught on. So in some sense, Haldane's theory remains in the mind of a great many people simply because they think of this as the hot dilute soup theory. An experiment which was done in 1953 seemed to lend credence to some of these ideas. This was an experiment performed amazingly enough by a young man as his PhD research program. So he got a PhD for this. Just imagine being told by your research supervisor, work out how life originated and you will get a PhD. But Miller did that, and his experiment was to take a reducing atmosphere, as you will see inside the flask there in the center. So that had water vapor, methane, ammonia, hydrogen. Then he passed electric discharges through that atmosphere, so that was the source of energy provided, and there's a complicated plan of tubes and cooling and so on and so forth. Eventually what happens, after waiting a very, very long time indeed, repeated discharges, high voltage, 60,000 volts, that kind of thing. This is a laboratory experiment, remember. You get some kind of condensate forming, and Miller was able to find that in that condensate, which is at the lower right hand part of this picture, some parts of this condensate consisted again of organic molecules of interest. He found some amino acids. He found things which were like sugars, not the sugars which are used in DNA and RNA directly, but were like sugars. So this created a sensation which was first reported because it appeared as if you could get such molecules forming under plausible physical conditions on the earth. I'll just read this part. So they discovered several types of simple organic molecules, including amino acids, some of which were relevant as the building blocks of proteins, and Miller was able to identify some specific amino acids, which are named glycine, alpha-alanine, which is interesting, beta-alanine, which is not that interesting, but he found it nonetheless. A person like Sidney Fox, person named, I beg your pardon, Sidney Fox, came up later, and he asked himself, fine, this experiment of Miller and Urey gives you amino acids, gives you some of this hot dilute soup, maybe later cold, thick soup, not so dilute. But what happens to it later? And Miller said that these things could polymerize, I beg your pardon, Fox said that these things could polymerize, and maybe polymerize to an extent that they could even give a rise to peptides or even proteins. Proteins are polymers of amino acids. And then of course you are really in business of some kind, because proteins are, as we said, the building blocks of matter, as living matter as we know it today. He called these elementary protein-like things proteinoids. And he also claimed that these polymeric structures could encase themselves within a shell of some kind, which he called a microsphere. So you really had something with a little bit of imagination, looked like a primitive cell, had things inside which primitive cells ought to have, and again maybe things can go on further. Fox also carried out experiments showing how this could happen, and in his proteinoids you could see them growing as they assimilated material from the outside. You could see them coming together. Sometimes you could see them breaking up into two. So doing the kinds of things that you would really like living cells to do. No one would call them alive, of course, but they present these signs of life. I'll skip this entirely. This is a fascinating example of a form of non-living matter which can be built in the lab, presumably is capable of coming together spontaneously and exhibits reproduction and metabolism. I present it here for those of you who would like to read up on it later to do so on your own. It's called the chemotone. That's the name which its creator gave it. For us here, the most interesting part of the story in this line, which line? The line which begins with aldenoperin, continues into Fox and proteinoids, goes through Miller and Urey, comes through Fox and proteinoids. The most interesting part of this line was the story taken up by Ranganayaki and Bahadur, Subramanian Ranganayaki and Krishna Bahadur, who at the University of Allahabad carried out a series of fascinating experiments resulting in this kind of primitive life structures, things which formed cell-like groupings, which were able to grow, which were capable of metabolism, which even carried out, they claimed, photosynthesis in the presence of light, which they christened Jivanu, living elements. And that work has been carried on brilliantly by Dr. Shashi Tutupalli, who is with us here in the audience, and I strongly suggest you get him over here because he's creating life. So instead of, there's a famous saying by Mark Twain, which says, everyone complains about the weather, but no one does anything about it. Similarly, everyone talks about creating life, but no one does anything about it, except for a few people like Shashi here. So please get him over, and he had set up a very nice demonstration. I saw it in, what's this thing called? The Science Gallery here on the airport road. And more impressively, I must say, in a metro station, I forget which one, which is the way to get science to the people. So life was being created in a metro station in Bangalore, in Namma Metro, if you wish to think of it. Okay, so again, long slide. What it indicates, this is, thanks to Shashi that I've got this. This is experimental results, experiments done by him and his colleagues. What it shows is that by putting together a defined combination of elements, that combination is shown on the left, you can actually get things happening. You can get these protocells forming, you can get them growing. At least in one of the pictures he showed me, they seem to move. I'm not sure, but they seem to go from place to place. They seem to divide. So something very interesting is happening here. Therefore, this line of attack certainly looks extremely promising. Remember, we started out right at the beginning by saying that among the requirements of life forms is that there has to be some means of utilizing energy to do useful work, which is really essentially anabolism, building up complex things. And one of the ways in which that might happen has come up recently, which is the energy provided by high temperature in what are called hydrothermal vents, deep sea vents, in which the temperature of the earth itself can heat up water to such an extent that when you get the kind of geometrical configuration that you see on the left side of the picture. So the left side of the picture indicates a naturally formed tiny opening to which the ocean has access. But this kind of a thing, given the constitution of the opening, can actually work to ionize water molecules, so separate hydrogen from hydroxyl ions, which is fascinating because if you can do that, you can treat this positive charge and the negative charge as the two poles of a battery and use that in the same way that you run a motor by using a battery to run chemical reactions. And in fact, that's what happens in our cells and in bacterial cells today. This thing is called, all of us have studied in school something called the EMF or electromotive force. This is called PMF or proton motive force. Hydrogen ions are of course protons. So this kind of idea has come up now, saying that hydrothermal vents might be a place where you could look for life. And something else which I told you about long ago, which means at the beginning of this talk, is the notion of autocatalysis. People have recognized now that it's possible for some chemical reactions to actually take place in our world today, meaning in the lab, to be set up, where a little bit of something can catalyze more of that same thing from happening. Can catalyze more of the same thing and enable it to happen, I mean. So this is indicated symbolically here in the form of these arithmetical equations, which are of course correct, but it's not the arithmetic that's the point here. So substance 1 and substance 2 give rise to substance 3. 1 and 3 give rise to a new substance which is called 4, and 4 breaks up to give 2 kinds of 2. Of course, those symbols are chosen purposely because the arithmetic hangs up, but it has nothing to do with the story, which is that this kind of reaction can take place. In fact, there's something organic chemists know called the Formose reaction, which is precisely this. So the idea here is there are things around in nature, in the inanimate world, which can both give you a source of energy and give you the means of autocatalysis, of reproduction. So it's not entirely meaningless to think of such things being brought together in an origin of life scenario. I've already mentioned this thing called an RNA world. People have examined it in great detail, and it looks sufficiently plausible for us to take it seriously today, meaning that there was a time in which you had life forms, but based only on RNA and proteins, not on DNA, RNA and proteins. In some ways, it's a good thing that this RNA world has come up, because it tells us if you want to understand how life originated, don't think in terms of DNA, because DNA was in any case a late addition to the story. I'm not going to go into these details. Okay, so a few timelines. One is a familiar one. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. The atmosphere was probably stabilized soon after that, 300 million years after that. The oxygen started appearing from about 3.5 to 4 billions. And these two worlds that we talked about, the pre-RNA world, the RNA world, etc., the DNA protein world, was probably around 3 to 3.5 million years ago. And that's when we ought to look for this last common ancestor or ancestors, as I told you, not a single one. The form of life that we are most familiar with, ourselves and our cousins, came much, much later on this scale, right towards the right hand side. So probably this primitive life and primitive life forms had easily 2 or 3 billion years of evolution before they advanced to the stage where cells were formed. So you had some kind of acellular life which existed for such a long period, which of course means that you have a long time over which this chemistry can work. Do we have time for about 2 minutes of videos now? Could you please screen them? What I am going to show before Sharanya screens the videos is to illustrate something for you which has not been taken sight of very seriously, though some people have paid attention to it, which is that in the absence of chemistry, there are purely physical phenomena which mimic the kinds of things that happen in living systems. So that's the only point that I want to make. These are all YouTube videos. You can spend your time on seeing them later. Which is the first one? 1 second. Yeah, the first one is very straightforward. Please look at it. I'll tell you what it is. Yeah. Stop there. What was that? A bunch of balls falling down through this series of layered sieves. At each layer, a ball hits one of the spherical obstacles in that layer and is randomly kicked to the left or the right. That's all. The balls have no communication with each other, and at each step they are kicked randomly to the left or the right. In fact, this is a textbook illustration that one uses in elementary statistical classes of what's called randomness, entirely random. No directive principle, other than gravity, of course, which is pulling things down. But the outcome is rather interesting. It's a mathematical distribution which has a certain precise form, which is attained more and more accurately the larger the number of these balls. So the point of this slide is simply to illustrate that you can get order, you can get organization of a kind solely from statistical principles. There is nothing underlying the way this thing is set up, which says you will get this sort of symmetric distribution with the largest number of balls in the center, fewer and fewer as you go out, and besides following this mathematical shape. Nothing of that kind. Next one, please. So that's a very, very elementary point. Nothing to do with origin of life, but to tell you that you can get order from randomness. I want you to see it first, then I'll tell you what you're seeing. That's it. Okay, what did you see there? These things are all disc-shaped polymer gels. So you can think of them as plasticky things, plasticky discs, except they're not plastic, they're, what are called viscoelastic materials. They have some kind of internal tension which is built up due to a combination of their material composition, the polymers inside them, the degree of hydration, the temperature, the packing, and so on. Simple physical phenomena. What they are doing, however, is to climbing up these states, as you noticed. And in fact, the film goes on. I've just stopped it here. Ultimately, all of them with some effort, they get tired, but with some effort, they climb all the way to the top. Purely physical phenomena. Nothing, there's no chemistry here either, by the way. Next slide.
Pattern formation
which is the third? Yeah, that one, that's right. Okay, so what did we see there? A series of black dots which seem to organize themselves in some way in this picture into nice shapes. I don't know how many of you caught them. There were some concentric circles and there were many more spirals going round and round. All very clear. If you saw them more carefully, you could see some of them merging and so forth, but doesn't matter. So they were doing things, doing something which looked interesting or fun to watch. What they are amoebae. Each dot is an amoeba of a particular species, which at one stage of its life cycle decides to become social, gets together with hundreds or thousands or even millions of other amoebae, forms these organized patterns and uses this sort of organization as a form of mutual communication to come together and build a body. Now that's a big story in itself, but that's what the amoeba does. Next please. Remember, that's proper living matter, so nothing non-living about it. Exactly the same kind of thing that you saw in those amoebae, except that here this is happening in the same sort of dish, by the way, a laboratory petri dish, but that dish is filled with some kind of a liquid of defined components which you can set up in class. By the way, that's something which I think is really worth doing by everyone, because the components are easily available and you should do it for yourself. Liquid, which is reddish in color when you first mix it, turns dull red, then turns brown, then turns blue, and sometimes keeps doing that. Blue after some time becomes red again, blue, red, blue. So it keeps flipping back and forth in terms of color. But sometimes, and you can trigger that as that person was doing by poking the liquid with his calipers, sometimes it also sets up this kind of concentric waves and spiral waves and rotary wave motion, and to all outward appearance, I'm sorry I couldn't get a better film here, to all outward appearance looks exactly like those amoeba coming together. So the point once again is, physical systems can self-organize, that is, organize themselves autonomously to display characteristics which you would say, oh, there's someone doing something here, or this must be alive, this must be a bug which is jumping from place to place. But that is not happening. This is a spontaneous thing. I think we're through, right? How do I get back to it? We're at the end of the talk. So to sum up, you can build up a kind of conceptual sequence of things that happened in the course of evolution of life on Earth. Some prebiotic soup, possibly. Then a combination of physical, chemical and biological to be phenomena, which is physical, because physics is there whether you like it or not, chemical because chemistry is there whether you like it or not, biological to be because biology hasn't begun yet. But a combination of those phenomena which give rise to self-assembly, self-organization, replication, then at some stage the building of a wall, metabolism inside that wall, and then, by the way, so this jumps over enormous periods of time, purely symbolic. At some stage the appearance of a DNA genome and so on and so on and so forth. And much, much later, those three primitive kingdoms that we wrote down there, which are already now, what was it, 2 billion or more years ago. And from then this entire panorama that we call evolution of life. So this is a kind of conceptual picture which might serve. And I've come to the end of my talk, and I'll just sum up what I think are the salient points which I've tried to get across. Firstly, being alive, this thing called life is a property of material entities. Please keep that in mind. No black magic anywhere. If that is true, life must have a material explanation. We know that the living forms around us have evolved from simple ancestors to complex descendants. Of that we are 100% sure, no doubt at all about evolution being a fact, however much ministers and several other people say they don't believe in it. That's 100% true. Therefore, there must have been a time when there was no life on Earth. Therefore, life must have originated. And there, of course, we have to say maybe on Earth, maybe elsewhere, but for the moment that doesn't concern us. As a working hypothesis, we can say it happened on Earth. But now we have learned to say that it may have had a single origin or many origins. There we can't afford to be dogmatic. Now comes this curious point. There are several reasonably plausible routes as to how life may have originated. All of them are, as I said, reasonably plausible. We are unable to choose among them at the moment. And it may be that this state of uncertainty will last. It may be that we will never be able to say that this is precisely how life originated. It may be lost. But being unable to say that is not the same thing as saying that this is a problem you can't solve. Rather, this may be a problem with embarrassingly too many solutions. So you are unable to say that this is the solution which actually operated in our history. Therefore, the question of how life originated raises interesting scientific issues. That must be kept in mind. And finally, this is the point that I try to make through these videos. In addition to the chemical approaches, which involve ordinary chemistry, the kinds of reactions which give rise to metabolism, in addition to biological approaches, which depend on trying to infer the history of molecules like DNA and RNA and proteins, there is some merit in paying more close attention to purely physical approaches, where if you wish, you deliberately ignore the biology and chemistry, or I should say chemistry and biology, and ask yourself what kinds of properties might physical matter exhibit, which you think is a reasonably good mimic what you would like an original life form to be. And I will end with this kind of thing, this slide which I thought put matters in perspective. This is a somewhat unfair slide, because time on the x-axis is shown in, well, it's shown in logarithmic units, it has to be, but goes back all the way to the inferred beginning of the universe on the very left, to what's called the Planck time. And you notice the bulk of the time since then, since the Big Bang, brought us only to where protons and electrons were formed. So that was the first second after the Big Bang. Just 1 second, literally 1 second, by the way, not just on this slide. So in this time scale of, let's say 15 billion years, within 1 second you already had nuclei appearing. And there's a famous book by Weinberg told us within the first 3 minutes you had everything appearing which was necessary for what we know. Anyway, the perspective part of it comes in that red vertical line. If you observe very closely, to the left of that vertical line there's an arrow. So that indicates when the sun and the earth were formed. To the right of that vertical line there's a second arrow which says when the sun and the earth will disappear eventually. Right? I mean, these are fairly accepted astrophysical scenarios, the sun expanding, becoming a red giant, swallowing up the earth, etc., etc., etc. So it's only within that thin sliver which you see here, barely discernible in terms of time, 3 times 10 to the 17 seconds after the Big Bang to 6 times 10 to the 17 seconds after the Big Bang. And everything happens. Everything. Literally everything. I don't mean just human history. There's a joke that used to be told that after that, of course, there is nothing, I mean, at least nothing that we would call meaningful, we today would call meaningful. So there's a joke which goes, someone gave a talk such as this and said the earth is going to disappear 4 billion years from now. And a member of the audience collapsed in shock. So people revived him and said, look, there's no reason to feel shocked. It's 4 billion years. Oh, he said, you said 4 billion. I'm sorry, I misheard you. I thought you said 4 million. So on that note, let me end. Thank you very much.
I'm sure all of you appreciate life is an amazing thing, in fact. Okay, we are part of it anyway. Okay. So anyway, the last few slides were really thought-provoking, and even I didn't think that only chemical and biological approaches, yes, that is what is commonly referred to about the origin of life. Yes, we can think of physical approaches also. This adds a new dimension, at least to me today. Thank you, sir. Thanks for this enlightening lecture. And as a mark of our appreciation, I request Ms. Sharanya to hand over a sapling to Professor Vidyanand Nanjundiah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
And I also request her to hand over a small memento to Professor Nanjundiah for gracefully accepting our invitation and delivering this wonderful lecture. Thank you, sir. Now we will have a Q&A for the next 20 minutes. And definitely, yeah, you can raise hands. Okay, this gentleman.
Sir, good afternoon, sir. I have two questions, sir. Sir, first question, sir, how can we promote paleontology in India, sir?
I'll need to think. It is true that paleontology doesn't appear to be as popular a discipline here as in many other countries.
Yes, sir.
And since when we talk about India, we always look over our shoulder and see China.
Yes, sir.
It should be mentioned that it's a thriving subject in China. And one of the big successes of Chinese
Yes, sir.
science, and you probably know this, has been in paleontology. Now, unfortunately, as with many kinds of science, this needs money,
Yes, sir. Money, sir. Yes, sir.
big money.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, there are places in India which are doing excellent paleontology. There is the Birbal Sahni Institute. There are some other people as well. But I really don't know. I mean, I heard a really sad story some years ago, which was that the geology department, by the way, paleontologists
Yes, sir.
are quite often trained in geology, you know. I heard that the geology department in Mysore University was closing down or was going to close down simply because no students were coming.
Yes, sir.
What do you do?
Yes, sir. Sir, same had happened in Bengaluru University, sir. Botany department. It was about to close, sir, because
My
of
God.
lack of faculty, sir. Faculties. Like Bengaluru University, sir.
What's happened now?
Nothing, sir.
Meaning it is operating still.
Yes, sir.
That's a tragedy. Space science has taken over everything.
Last question.
I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to your question. It has to be done.
Okay, sir. Sir, my second question, sir. Why cannot living be quantum process, sir, rather than material process?
You know, that's an interesting point. So I'll reframe your question.
Yes, sir.
I said that the understanding of life has to depend on conventional physics and chemistry,
Yes, sir.
which is the physics and chemistry most people do most of the time. Ordinary, mundane physics. Now, clearly, physics itself depends essentially on quantum mechanics. So the question is, are there quantum phenomena which are essential for understanding aspects of life? In other words, are there aspects of living systems which cannot be explained by non-quantum arguments? That's a point which people have thought of. The general answer to that is, doesn't appear to be the case except maybe in a few exceptional situations. For example, an argument has been made that the phenomenon of photosynthesis, which of course is the bedrock of all forms of life that we have now, because that's where you get your oxygen from, photosynthesis apparently is an essentially quantum phenomenon. What's called the efficiency of photosynthesis can be explained only by quantum mechanics. So there may be a few such phenomena. Other than that, whatever happens inside our bodies or the bodies of bacteria to enable us to understand them doesn't seem to require quantum mechanics. Of course, to understand the chemistry of those molecules, you do need quantum mechanics, no question of that. But once you take the molecule's existence for granted, right, it appears you don't need it.
Thank you. I have few questions. First question is, in Pasteur's experiment, doesn't it depend on what kind of materials he choose? Is it possible to conclude that this is not a reasonable conclusion that what he
Yeah,
does
very much.
Okay. Second question is, do proteins, we know amino acids sort of have non-living functions, but have we seen proteins doing things that are non-living, like not related to life?
You mean, are there proteins in the world not associated with living organisms? I can't think of any offhand. Can you? Proteins, actually? I don't know.
And another question I had is, you mentioned about these three different branches, but is it possible to conclude that life sort of originated in different places through different processes, in different ways, and what we see today is sort of a culmination of all of these things?
Indeed, yeah.
That is it.
Yeah.
Okay. I have more questions, I'll follow up later.
So thank you for the wonderful talk. Sir, you had mentioned the change in the composition that is happening in the Earth's crust and the Earth. How do you see the human race? How do you what is your reason for change in the composition that is being happening, and could that change in the composition could make another change from a chimpanzee to a human being and a human being to another race, a human advanced race in the future? How do you see that, sir?
You know, that will need a very long answer. So I'll answer a slightly different question. I don't know whether this is what you had in your mind. Were you under the impression that chimpanzees had evolved to give rise to human beings? Is that your impression?
Sir, does the composition of the environment that is being there could lead to a more advanced human beings or advanced human race that could happen in the another million or a billion years?
No, you used the term chimpanzees to human beings.
It's just that I'm mentioning it because it is getting more advanced over the years. Does the environment...
Chimpanzees evolving to become something like human beings.
Yes.
Okay, fine. Okay, so the answer is the following. In terms of my talk, by environmental composition, I meant the elemental composition. Now that has pretty much remained unchanged from the beginning. Even with all these asteroid impacts and meteoroids and so on, other than the elements in the periodic table, I don't know what their number is now, 110, 120, you don't have anything else. So that has not changed at all. What has changed, of course, is the broad physical and chemical environment. Lands have moved, temperatures have changed, well we are aware of that here. Things of that kind have happened. And that has of course affected long range evolution, there is no doubt of that at all. Right, so biogeography has been an essential component of evolution all along, right from the beginning. And I gave one simple example of where there was no oxygen at the start, and therefore you could get things happening because of a reducing atmosphere, which couldn't have happened if the atmosphere had been highly oxidizing. So that kind of thing can happen. But whether you can link that with the evolution of an ape-like creature into a human-like creature, I'm really not sure. Yes.
So good evening, sir. I just have a simple question. So we have thermodynamic law called as entropy of a universe is continuously.
A bit slow. Can you keep the mic a bit away from your mouth? Yeah, no.
The entropy of the universe is continuously increasing. So what my question is, the life which evolved on the earth, which is contributing to the entropy. So how do you comment on the entropy which is before the life evolved? It is most of the entropy depends on the life. So how do you comment on the entropy which is before the life evolved? Because we define the entropy as continuously increasing. So how do you define, sir?
One point, if you were to literally calculate the total entropy of the earth and atmosphere, if you wish, I suspect that the contribution made by living organisms would be so tiny that you could ignore it. It would be infinitesimal. Doesn't come into the calculation at all. Okay. Second point. Living organisms, by building order, obviously decrease entropy within themselves. But they do this by carrying out metabolism, and the waste products of metabolic reactions increase the entropy of the surroundings. So what the second law of thermodynamics tells you is that the total entropy of the organism plus its surroundings must be increasing. And as far as we can tell, that happens all the time. So there is no question of living organisms doing something which is preventing the overall entropy from increasing.
Vidya here. Vidya?
Hi, Mama.
Just one question. Many times when I tell students that Darwin never worried about origin of life, in the species also, the book also never speaks about, except the last paragraph. They are very surprised. But what I want to say is that in the case of origin of life process, in the abiotic world, chemicals could actually undergo natural selection, right? So if you have one compound, when they assemble, particular form is there that is helpful for further assembly, that will be selected. natural selection can also work in the inanimate world. Just want to make a...
I'll just repeat the question, which is, two parts. First, Dr. Mahadevan commented that most of what Darwin had to say in his development of the theory of evolution involved evolution after life had originated. Completely true. And the second point he made was that there are elements in the theory of evolution, that particular theory of evolution that Darwin propounded. Its technical name is natural selection. There are elements in that theory which could have been used even in the inanimate world. That's also true. Thanks.
Sir, from what I was able to gather, this DNA, RNA and protein, these are three elements which you spoke, sir, basically. But actually, going back to my school days, there was a small experiment, a rat and a plant in a thermos flask or something like that, glass flask. And there was another one without a plant. And the rat will die because there is no plant. And the transfer of oxygen and carbon dioxide was there. That was the thing which is just ringing in my mind. But there was not any mention of oxygen, sir. Because when we were studying, I think when the elements combined, I think once the plant life came, then of course, we are talking of life. When the origin of life actually started from the moment where the oxygen supply was abundant. That was one thing which I was remembering. So, but maybe my theories, my ideas were very different. So, flora and fauna.
Can I interrupt right there? Then
okay,
you can
right,
carry
okay,
on.
okay, sir. Right, sir.
You are absolutely right. The kinds of life that we are most familiar with today depend on oxygen. There is no question of that. There are still forms of life which depend on the absence of oxygen. So there are organisms which depend on a reducing atmosphere. And even today you can carry out experiments. For example, there are things which derive energy by fermentation, reactions which proceed by fermentation, for which oxygen is a poison. But you are right, the vast majority of organisms we are familiar with depend on oxygen. But it's fairly clear that life originated on Earth at a time when oxygen certainly was not disconcentrated in the atmosphere. Either it was missing, as we said, entirely reducing atmosphere, or present in very low amounts.
Because we all see that when anybody is admitted, we see that oxygen level.
Yes.
That sustains life.
Yes, for us.
So that's what
our form of life.
I see, sir.
That's true.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, my question is, are human beings currently evolving?
Is that the question?
Are human beings currently evolving?
Is that the question?
And are there any study to prove that?
Plenty. Yeah. The answer is yes. They are evolving, but they are not evolving in a way within our lifetimes or within hundreds of our lifetimes that will make it immediately obvious to you by looking at them. This is where studies of evolution which look at DNA, RNA and proteins become important. So you can see changes in human populations, changes which are measurable, which you can correlate to changes in reproductive ability, which in turn you can correlate with their DNA, RNA and protein composition. So the answer is yes, but nothing that you would recognize visibly and say, oh, this is a different kind of person, and certainly not within a lifetime. The time scale is so small that you wouldn't notice it. However, if you ask the same kind of question about a bacterium, you can do that, and you can actually see changes which make you think this is a different kind of cell, visibly different. That can happen.
Hello, good evening, sir. My name is Ajit. Recently I was studying a book called Murderous Mathematics. There I came
Tell me
across
the name again.
Recently I was studying a book called Murderous Mathematics. Its title is little weird, but Murderous Mathematics. There I come across a very interesting paragraph which talks about how rare the process to start life itself was. And the analogy it was given was, you fly in an aeroplane, you take a jigsaw puzzle with 1 million pieces you throw from the airplane, so the probability those jigsaw puzzle come in the correct shape is same as the probability of getting life started. What's your comment on this, sir?
I think that's a good analogy. Extremely rare phenomenon, you're right.
So,
very good analogy.
Okay. So it means life is very, very rare. So does that mean it might be only Earth that's supporting life throughout the universe also?
That's a fascinating question in its own right. Comes back into Dr. Guru Prasad's area. There are people called astrobiologists who study that seriously, by the way. And I think some of our expeditions have also tried to look for signs of metabolism, signs of chemistry going on and so on. Absolutely no answer to that so far, as far as I know. Okay? But it's a very rich field for speculation. Science fiction writers have thought a lot about it. But as far as I know, once again, there's nothing that you can get your hands on by way of information on which you can build.
No, next is not my question, but today is 19th birth anniversary of Carl Sagan. So I was expecting some contribution to Carl Sagan, but I didn't see anything here. So it's not a question, just 19th birth anniversary of Carl Sagan. Thank you.
By the way, since you mentioned that, let me just say something for those of you who may not know. Carl Sagan produced a very fine TV series long ago, 30, 40 years ago, called Cosmos. Please take a look at it. I'm fairly sure it must be easily available these days. The name is Cosmos. And I think it had 20 episodes, or maybe a dozen episodes. Do watch it. It's a history of the universe.
Hi, Professor Nanjundiah. Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you that, get your opinions on this. So you seem very convinced that life happened during an anaerobic phase of Earth.
During, I beg your pardon?
During reducing phase of Earth's atmosphere.
That seems to be the consensus.
Yeah. But there are other competing hypotheses about this, like life arrived on a meteor, and we never know what the atmosphere on that other chunk of planet or other meteorite could have been. The other hypothesis, of course, could have been coming from the synthetic biology experiments, where we're seeing novel amino acids and novel nucleic acids getting imprinted into DNA, and there are like 5 base DNA or something like that happening. So I'm just wondering if you could touch upon the alternate hypothesis that could potentially...
Yeah, very true, but you must keep in mind, at best, so far, meteorites and asteroids give you complex molecules. That's it, by themselves. Formaldehyde. Now, formaldehyde is not alive, but formaldehyde is interesting enough so that you can say complex things can happen. So you can continue to speculate on life forms elsewhere, you understand, but not beyond that.
But what about the evidence from synthetic biology where they're producing novel
synthetic biology is extremely interesting
acids.
because what it shows you is that it probably within the lifetimes of some of you here, certainly, someone may create something that by general consensus people will say is alive. True. But whether that tells you anything about how life on Earth originated, I don't know.
That we'll never know, but it also opens the possibilities that these could have been the ways where...
If you use the right kinds of molecules and the right kinds of conditions, yes.
Yeah.
But I think synthetic biology in this way is of interest on its own.
Sure.
It shows you can make something, it's a robot-like entity which is agential.
Yeah. But also these time scales, they are mostly based on geological calibrations, which also could have been like one day someone disproves some geological calibration, all of evolutionary biological time scales fall apart in a way.
I don't think that's likely now. Because hang on. Obviously, I'm, basing my answer on what I have read and heard, not on what I worked on. I think it's reasonably sure that the Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago. I don't think you can get away from that. I think it's reasonably sure that when it was formed, it was essentially molten, or at least so hot that nothing interesting would have happened. So these two facts you can not get away from, and then it cooled and so on and so forth.
I was talking more about Luca and all, sorry, I should have mentioned. So those calibrations of the phylogenetic time scales, they are a lot based on...
Oh, that's very interesting. Hang on. Luca, of course, is beyond our knowledge now. But phylogenetic time scales, real time, today are being more and more set by biology. So there's something called a biological clock. Well, there are many biological clocks. This is a biological clock which in inverted commas, within DNA. So this is something extremely interesting. It turns out, and there's a solid theoretical foundation for this too, it turns out that certain changes in DNA occur in an almost clock-like fashion. So if you can infer the number of changes that have occurred, you can say the origin was this many generations ago. We're on very good ground there. By very good, I mean again, give or take a factor of 2, which is nothing.
Last question. Yeah, this lady here, please.
Sir, I have a question on, I want your comment based on, you said physics, chemistry and played a key role in the origin of life. I want your comment on what drives survival in life.
Come again?
What drives survival in life?
Drives survival.
What drives survival?
Well, ordinary physical and chemical processes. So if you take a bacterium, the process of a bacterium assimilating food from the environment, growing physically, making copies of its DNA and other things inside it, and ultimately splitting into 2.
Why does it make a copy of itself?
Chemistry. Why does an acid and base give you salt and water? Same reason. Right? Obviously, you can still probe further and say, what are precisely the molecular interactions between acids and bases which do this, which of course people do. In that case, you do understand quite a bit. In this case too, you understand quite a bit. So the details of the chemical details of DNA replication have been worked out in great, to great accuracy. We're very confident about that. The details of physical growth of bacteria are also worked out reasonably well, but I think there are gaps. There are things happening there that we need to study further. No doubt of that at all. Where we lack most details is in the way in which the chemistry of the cell is regulated. But their facts are piling up day by day. So none of these is an area of study where people would say, look, this is too mysterious for us to think of.
Actually, after her question, I felt that I should ask this question. The thing is that we know that all those biomolecules, proteins and carbohydrates are there. They have formed. That is what we taught about origins in life. But when we see a dead body, of course, all those materials are still present there, but life isn't there. That means that metabolism is life. But what initiated metabolism wasn't the presence of these molecules. So what exactly happened? That I wanted to know. And secondly, I had this question that, is there any aspect of evolution or formation of life with cancer cells?
Okay, the second question is easier, so I'll try and address that. Cancer cells are a very good example of evolution happening inside the body. Very nice example. And in fact, there are many models of cancer cells, of the phenomenon of cancer, which actually parallels models for evolution of organisms. You get mutations, you get modifications in properties due to those mutations, you get some of those modifications being advantageous to the cell, not to the body, to that cell, and therefore they spread. Very close parallels. So you're absolutely on spot on there. There's an analogy between the development of cancers and biological evolution in the way we understand it. No question. Now your first question, I'm not fully sure I understand it. Medical people of course have standard ways of deciding when a person is dead. You know all of this, cessation of respiration, of response to sensory stimuli. You can, if you wish, measure brain activity and so forth. But this is life or death in a very, very complex creature like us. I think it would be more meaningful to ask the same question of a bacterium maybe, or of a yeast cell. Now there, the operational definition of life or death is very simply this. A single cell is alive if given the right conditions it can make copies of itself. If it cannot, it's not alive. Even there you run into tricky situations because some cells will not make copies of themselves for ages. So you need patience. You understand what I mean? So their metabolism may die down, but they may be able to eventually replicate. So you have to keep that in mind too.
But anyway, when Carl Sagan came, I remembered, one gentleman asked about competing theories as to origin of life and all those things. When this question in 1996 came on Martian life, the so-called nanobacteria, that kind of thing from Mars in one meteorite, it was observed and all those things. At that time, Carl Sagan told, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidences, in fact. That is one thing. And second thing is, anyway, about life elsewhere in the universe, we have not yet detected. So, Carl Sagan quoted somebody else, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That is, thank you, sir. Thank you very much, Dr. Anand.
It's my privilege to present a vote of thanks of today's event. Today's talk pondered upon the origin of life through the spectra of different science faculties like physics, chemistry, and even statistics. The remarkable insights that you provided fascinated us looking at the grandness of the simple questions, what is our origin? Thank you, sir. Thank you for making this evening very special. Thank you. And I also thank the audience and many students here who have gathered here to listen to him for being with us and supporting us and encouraging us to organize such lecture events. Thank you very much.
I'm very sorry, we got just an online question now. Can I post that? Yeah. So I can give you this mic, sir. While proteins have amino acids in L form, I know there's theories about chirality playing very important role in origin of life and stable polymer, but fact that particular chirality is preferred. I don't know if it's a comment or...
Okay, so the question is, biological molecules, many biological molecules exhibit what's called handedness. It's also called optical activity. The components of proteins, amino acids, exhibit one kind of optical activity, one sense of optical activity. Sugars exhibit other kind. So the question is, if I understood it correctly, in all these ways in which these molecules could be formed chemically, how do we ensure that the right handedness also appears? Now, this is a question which I very, very carefully tried to avoid. But someone who listened to this talk online has tripped me up by bringing it to the front. The answer is, none of these theories for prebiotic life, so some form of life before we had DNA, RNA and so on, none of these theories or models make account of handedness, take handedness into account. That's a fact. So you need something quite beyond this to say why all the amino acids that are naturally occurring in proteins are left-handed. By the way, you can get other amino acids in living organisms which are right-handed too. That's a different matter. But all the amino acids which occur in proteins are left-handed. None of these theories and models take that into account. So you need to bring something else into the picture, some kind of accidental seeding at the beginning in which only left-handed amino acids and only right-handed sugars could take part. I realize that's not a satisfactory answer because it's not an answer at all. It says it happened that way. So clearly this is an additional puzzle which we need to confront.
Thank you, sir.
Just here is a gentleman, young gentleman, who has written a poem, it seems, about Carl Sagan on his 90th birthday today. Just quickly, please.
So, hello. Actually, I'm a very big fan of Carl Sagan. So, today on 90th birth anniversary, I've written a small poem, just 8 lines for him. In memory of Carl Sagan, My dear Sagan, how it feels among the stars. Can you locate where we are? The world has not changed much since you left. The system is still dumb and deaf. My dear Sagan, your hunter-gatherer has evolved into hunter-snatchers. Your pale blue dot is now pointless. Your cosmos doesn't exist. Your humanity remains within book countless. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.